trying to figure out what to use when. So like there's some options where it's purely consumption based, but then you may run into a situation like you saw where that works better if I've got a fixed cost. So there are options to be able to do that. So, and I've also done this talk for Integration Down Under, which is a webcast. You can go to integrationdownunder.com to get that full recording, because this was going to be a little bit shorter. We're fitting it into a smaller amount of time. Here's the details about myself. I'm a cloud platform and API evangelist for 6pivot. And I started out in Australia back in 2000, mostly doing integration and some middleware software from Microsoft called BizTalk. So that's where my Twitter handle came from. It's still there. So basically what we want to talk about is with the integration stack on Azure, we have multiple ways of doing things. And it was interesting when I was, so BizTalk was a product that Microsoft sold. This is a little bit of history. But interestingly enough, the biggest competitor for BizTalk wasn't some of the other integration products because they were too expensive. It was the developer building themselves in code. So just writing a point-to-point integration and deploying it. Where a lot of people thought, oh, it's got to be web methods or one of the other integration packages and things like that would be competing. But it wasn't. It was actually just the developers doing that translation and code themselves. What they decided to do, and what's confusing a little bit about integration stack in Azure is that it's not a single product. And that's what I'm going to kind of go through a little bit of what the different things are and when you would use what. So, because what he was talking about earlier is that there's a lot of services we can consume. And one of the things we'll see with the logic apps, there's about 1,000 connectors for logic apps that are out there. And there's only probably 25% of those that are Microsoft. The rest of them are all of the other services out there. Dropbox, all of the different storage providers, all of those kind of things. But you're making, it's a consumption-based service that you're using for that. So one of the interesting things about where the integration services came from inside of Microsoft and inside of Azure is that they had a product that was called BizTalk. Everybody was looking to get that moved to Azure, but that really didn't fit with the ideas they had for Azure. They wanted something that would work across all the products. They didn't want a silo product. They wanted something that would work across it. And that's kind of how we got where we're at. So one of the things I want to, and this is kind of a little chart we're going to spend most of our time talking through, but just to give you a little bit more background on the integration side of things is that similar to AWS, we have Service Bus, which is a message queuing service. We have functions, which are fairly close to Lambda in a lot of the ways, where it's very small bits of code. They react to events. And that's where you write code. And then we have kind of the logic app side of things, which is the workflow. So if you're a diehard coder, logic apps you're not going to like, because you're dragging shapes onto a surface and you're configuring how they work, what connection they use, things like that. But for a lot of people, and they also have a slightly lower tiered version of that. If you're familiar with Power Automate, if you've got an Office 365 subscription, you'd have access to Power Automate, which is basically the same thing that would run in Azure, but it's running in kind of your own workspace. You're not sharing it with everybody. And it's all consumption based, but the pricing's different because it's part of your Office 365. But today, the three we're going to talk about is Logic Apps consumption. This is the original version of the Logic Apps, where you create a Logic app, You deploy it into Azure, and it runs on the Logic App runtime. So you don't have to deploy the runtime or anything. You just deploy your Logic App and it runs. You pay per trigger, per action. So you've got that same model. So if your Logic App does 10 actions, those 10 actions, every time it runs will cost you, I think it's 0.0001 cents per action. So you've got that consumption side of things. Now, how many people love polling? Nobody. Surprise, surprise. So that is one of the downfalls about the consumption-based services, is if you're polling, they usually do something under the covers to do that polling, and you have to pay for it. So if you're looking for something to appear on a queue or something to appear in a storage account, and you decide I want to check every 2 seconds, you've got one action that you're paying for every 2 seconds. One of those is not going to be bad per month, but 1,000 of those is going to push your bill a lot higher than you really expected it for the fact that you weren't doing anything. So that is one of the things. They have implemented the full eventing model using another product in Azure called Event Grid. So basically you get storage events. So when a blob is created on the storage account, you'll get an event that says it was created. You can also get an event that says it was updated, all of those kind of things. And you can create your own events. So if you got application talking to another part of your application, you can create that same type of event and send that eventing information to it. So one of the other things that we'll look at in this comparison is function apps. So these are the function apps. Function apps have similar style setup. So you'll pick your function app wants to be an HTTP request, or your function app wants to be a blob was created in the storage account, or a message was put onto a message queue, and you can have that. And it takes care of all that plumbing, which again, as he was speaking about earlier, makes the code that you have to write a lot less. It's only that business logic that you want to do with the message or with that web request. So if we go through that first column, it's kind of cost-based. So our Logic Apps, consumption-based, you pay per action, and you pay, there are some enterprise-style actions, like if you want to talk to SAP, that action costs you a little bit more money, but you still can do it. I have put ISE there. If you want your Logic Apps to run completely hidden from the outside world inside of a virtual network, which means that everybody can't hit them, they're inside of that, you need to run an ISE, which an ISE, again, is the same thing as we were talking about earlier. It's a set of virtual machines that you set up to run your Logic Apps. So you're buying the virtual machines at that point. So even though it comes under a consumption-based product, it's really not consumption-based. You're paying for virtual machines. The Logic App Standard. This is a new thing that they've done. And this one has got a app service plan. So very similar to the way you spin up a website in Azure, you got a virtual machine sitting back there that's running it. And again, this does mitigate some of the costs because you will use however much of that virtual machine that you have, and then you can scale up and scale down. But you do have that fixed cost per month. You don't have the same thing. If I had a Logic App and I was processing 10 web requests a week, you wouldn't go to standard because you got that upfront cost of a app service plan. Functions is an interesting one. Function is you can have a consumption-based app service plan where you don't pay except when you use it. It's slightly different than the logic apps in terms of actions. It's a calculation based on how much CPU and how much memory you use. So, and basically that sets up your costing there. But function apps also can run in an app service plan. And they can also run in the same app service plan as your website. So if you're using them in conjunction with your website, you could put all of that in one. That would consolidate your cost. We're going to get into a little bit further down. We'll get into some of the other good features around containerizing. So some of these will run in containers. The hosting model. So how many people are writing software that your organization requires it to be behind a firewall and limit access from everybody? Okay, so that's the one problem that we've run into with the consumption-based logic apps, because they run in a multi-tenanted environment. You can put API management and things like that in front of them, but they're still sharing that multi-tenanted environment with other applications. Logic App Standard, because they're running in your app service plan, it's a single tenant. Same with functions. One of the other interesting things that came about with both the Logic App Standard and Logic Apps and Function Apps is they do need storage. And they log to that storage. So if you've got logic apps that are logging lots of information, you may increase your storage cost. So the big one about that discussion we were having just a minute ago about whether it needs to be inside of a firewall is that whether it supports VNet integration. So the logic apps consumption doesn't support it. You cannot run it inside of a VNet unless you run your own ISE, which again, a bunch of virtual machines that you're paying for. The Logic App Standard, yes, it integrates well, and function apps on a certain app service plan will integrate with your VNet integration. Now, another interesting one that if you're just AWS, you won't get an idea of what this means, but the Azure has implemented a thing called private endpoints. So what it allows you to do is it allows you to communicate with your public services through a private connection so that the traffic doesn't go outside of that private connection, so it doesn't go out across the internet or go between the on the public internet between services. So the big one that people were waiting for Logic App Standard for is local debugging and testing. How many people have run an Azure function? Anybody? So Azure functions basically have a little runtime in your development environment running on your laptop that spins up. It allows you to do your debugging and testing locally and not have to deploy it into Azure to do that. So that's one of the big features of that. Again, coming back to one of the other ones is that polling side of things. Is that polling doesn't support or costs you in a consumption-based service. I don't know how Lambda does that. Do they have service things that poll like for storage, or is it all eventing? Very eventing, yeah. So you can get around most of the polling in Azure with that. The other thing is that the Logic Apps consumption-based is just JSON. So from a diehard developer, it was really hard to get used to just deploying a chunk of JSON as opposed to something that you had to compile and deploy. The Logic App Standard has made that process a bit better because it's actually not a compile, but it is a copy and deploy. So it's a little bit easier on the way to do that. Function apps is code. So function apps will run in C#, Java, Python, PowerShell if you really want to. So there's a lot of different languages for that, and they're also based on .NET Core, if you're familiar with .NET Core, which means it'll run on both Windows and a Windows and a Linux platform. So, and I think at the last time I heard, there was actually more Linux services running on Azure than Windows services, because Microsoft was pushing all the .NET Core stuff to Linux. So the other thing that makes a difference when you're looking at your logic apps is how you deploy them. So the original logic apps consumption was a single logic app gets deployed by itself. So you'll see, if you go into your Azure subscription, you'll see 25 logic apps, if you've got those. If you use Logic App Standard, you can group those and you can have them, I think say you'd have 3 Logic App Standard that has 5 logic apps inside of them. It also makes it easier to communicate between them, but you still can communicate across to those. And again, function apps are the same way. So you can have multiple HTTP triggers, you can have one HTTP trigger, you can have one storage trigger, queue trigger, all of those kind of things inside of that single function app, and deploy those. Let's see. The other one is how you set parameters for deployment. So when you deploy a Lambda, how do you set up like its connections to things?
Like, depends on how you do it, but yeah, like it's just like triggers.
So yeah, so one of the things that Logic Apps has is you can munge the deployment. So you can go in and modify the JSON file when you deploy it to set the keys and things like that if you wanted to. But with Logic App Standard and Function Apps, it now uses the old style web config. If you remember from most of the web development, has a configuration file that you can go read. But with Azure, the app service provides that web config, and it also can use things like the key vault, and they've got a new service called app config, which allows you to be able to control all your app configuration in one spot. So you can have a dev environment, a test environment, and prod. But as we know, we only want prod. And then there's a few features that were primarily BizTalky features. How many people have had to try to do a edifact message in code? How many people know what edifact is?
Yeah, what's edifact?
So, have you ever worked with a logistics company?
Yes, unfortunately.
Yes. So the logistics world runs on either edifact or X12, depending on your geography. So your edifact is the rest of the world, X12 is the US. And it basically...
Which means if you're not on X12, you work with both.
Yeah, so, and interestingly enough, my best description of both of those is that they were invented when a 1200 baud modem was high speed. So they're not readable. So they use delimiters of like a tilde a lot, and they basically munge out all of the extra characters so that they can send. But almost I did a project just recently with JB Hi-Fi. They talked to all of their suppliers. Maybe not all of them, maybe 90% of their suppliers through edifact or X12. So one of the things that the logic apps give us the ability to do is to be able to create those messages without having to dig in and understand everything about X12 and EDIFACT. So that's one of the good things, because that was one of the primary uses a lot of customers had BizTalk for, was that kind of thing. Now, if you get a message in and you need to change it from XML to JSON, what's the typical way you would do that?
Load and store.
Huh?
Load to memory and then store.
Yeah, so you build two classes, you'd load it into the memory as that, and then you would output it as the other serial. Yeah. So one of the things that is available in the logic apps that's not available in a lot of things is, if you're familiar with XSLT, which is a mapping language for XML. But the latest one is, have you heard of Liquid? So he mentioned Shopify earlier. Shopify use Liquid to basically lets you take a data file and turn it into a web page by wrapping the tags and things like that around it. But it also works for data translation, so from one schema to another schema. So that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about. And the big thing is that when you look at your integration stack, is that in Azure, there's always multiple ways of doing it. I mean, in pretty much any environment, there's going to be multiple ways of doing it. You could write a full-blown website to do it, do APIs, you could do, and that's the nice thing about all of these technologies in Azure, is they can all be exposed as APIs. So that you basically expose those business services that are calling those in the background. So if you haven't looked at Logic Apps, if you were at last month's talk with Lars, or go look at the recording, one of the things he did with Logic Apps was around that image resizer. He was driving some of that with a Logic App, and then he did the hardcore coding with a function app to actually invoke the image resizer. So you can see that if you look at that talk from last time about how these different tools play into that integration and your website side of things. The biggest thing to do is to look at Logic Apps consumption because of all of the connectors it offers. So if you can think of, I'm trying to think what the last count was, about 1,000 connectors for different tools. One of the best ones, like right now, is being able to process email. So they do email and calendaring and all that kind of stuff for you. They do all of the different storage providers, so Box, Dropbox, OneDrive, all of those kind of things. And again, you decide whether you want to write code or whether you want to drag and drop. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea about how to choose that technology in Azure, of what you want to do. And again, I've got a longer talk with a bit more discussion in each of these topics in depth online if you want to go into a little bit more of that. So that's pretty much it. I'm going to skip the demo for brevity's sake. But again, are there any questions?
One quick one.
Yep.
So looking at that list between the Logic Apps consumption and the Logic Apps standard, one thing that's interesting is that when you have the Logic Apps consumption running in the secure environment, you pretty much lose all of the upsides, it seems. So what is the case where you would run Logic Apps consumption inside the ISC instead of Logic Apps standard?
Surprisingly enough, I couldn't find any really good reason to. But I had customers that insisted on it being in an isolated environment. But also, we had customers in Europe that were really heavily into logic apps. And if you paid the consumption cost, it was 100,000, and they could run the ISE for 7,500 a month. So it actually did a cost savings for them because it capped that consumption cost.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, so it was interesting because I had no customers that would have benefited from ISE, but then all of a sudden the MVPs that I'm in a group with were saying, oh, this is great because now we can compete against some other products that have their own runtimes because we can cap that cost. So it goes the opposite, but it goes back to your question earlier about the fact that you've got a fixed cost for those consumption-based services. So, but watch this space. They're making some changes on that because the Logic App standard gives you similar capabilities because it uses that runtime. And it auto scales that runtime. Thank you very much.
Bill?